G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, I'm going to go through my team selection for the Bahrain Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So let's jump straight into how the team did in Japan. 137 points all out, $3 million budget gain, no DNFs. So a pretty solid weekend on all accounts. It was a small red arrow by about 14,000 down to 419k overall, still obviously bleeding out from the Ferrari double disqualification in China, but I think the team's pretty well set up for the next few races heading into the desert in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and then Limitless in Miami. So I think with how things are back on track for budget and a couple of transfers up my sleeve this week, looking forward to seeing how things can obviously be structured for the next race weekend. Oscar Piastri, the highest scoring driver, 24 points, 2x, became 48. P3 in qualifying, P3 in the snooze fest of a race. And to be honest, I don't think there was necessarily too much more I could have asked from Oscar. I obviously made the decision to hold on to him for this week with the expectation that he would finish within 10 points of Lando Norris and not justify myself taking a -10. That obviously held true. Lando Norris, outscored his teammate, but it was only by 3 extra points. So I would have been down -7. And with a bit less budget flexibility heading into Bahrain had I decided to go down that route. Piastri missed out on the fastest lap by less than 1/10 of a second as well. So a bit bummed he couldn't obviously bank that extra 10 points, but notwithstanding that, a pretty solid race weekend. All in all, McLaren obviously propping up the team with 71 points, and I still think they are the premier constructor in F1 fantasy. Haas obviously doing their part, but I think, Hulk and Stroll, given they've come away with single-digit performances this weekend, Hulk obviously had a single-digit score in China as well. These guys are looking likely for a price drop in Bahrain, so we'll obviously have to assess what that means for fantasy and our team selection decisions heading into the next race weekend. Let me know how you guys did this weekend in the comments below. I think most people escaped decently with no DNFs as well out in Suzuka. In terms of the weekend and takeaways from there, I think I talked about it already, but McLaren very dominant in the race week and entirely. But I think the biggest surprise to me was Max Verstappen doing what he could in that RB21. Definitely did not deserve to be on pole or win the race in that car, but showed he is an absolute juggernaut when it comes to a Formula One. Is he a Formula One fantasy asset that's viable right now? I'm not so sure he is, but it just goes to show the class and superiority he has over the rest of the grid, even in a car that is wildly inferior to a team like McLaren. So he wins 4 in a row at Suzuka, 4 pole positions in a row as well. Definitely got him on my radar this time in 12 months. In terms of budget enablers, Hadjar and Bortoleto, they bottomed out at $4.5 million after going down not even 0.6. Hadjar, I believe, was 5 million heading into the deadline in Japan. Bortoleto 4.8. So not even the maximum price drop, given the floor for prices in fantasy is capped out at 4.5. What does that mean for our teams? I think both of these guys now become exceptional enablers. Hadjar specifically, and we'll talk about that in just a second, primarily because the 3-race rolling average no longer includes their Australian DNF result. So it just means that the threshold for them to meet for a maximum price rise is much lower. And I think that suddenly makes them attractive options in F1 fantasy. As I said, Hadjar specifically simply because of the fact he hasn't really struggled on the same level, I would say, as someone like Gabriel Bortoleto. On f1fantasytools.com/budget-builder, you can see Hadjar in Bahrain requires -2 points for a $0.6 million price increase, the lowest of all drivers on the back of his 11 and 8 in the last 2 race weekends. Doohan as well, 11 and 6, so he only needs 3 points. Bortoleto, however, even though he is at 4.5 and does become a good enabler, needs at least 8 points for any price rise. I think even for him, that's probably a stretch in that Sauber and on a non-sprint weekend. So he got close to 8 in China, but that was with an extra session of racing. So I think fascinating to me that Hadjar, after 2 very good races at 4.5, I think will be a top priority transfer for most people this weekend. On the contrary, Hulk and Stroll have had some underwhelming results of late. Hulkenberg very low single-digit results across China and Japan. Stroll, his first score of less than 10 points this season in Suzuka as well. So I do think both of these guys, just again, how the pricing model is wired for 2025, they've obviously needed to hit X number of points for a price jump in Japan, a not very high threshold. Hulkenberg needed, I think it was something like 6 points for the 0.6. He didn't quite get to that mark, so ended up with a $0.2 million increase. Stroll just had to finish the race pretty much, and he did that. He got his 0.6 bump. But now again, if we go back to Budget Builder just very quickly, he needs 8 points for a price rise. He was struggling around P20 the entire race. He pitted one extra time compared to a lot of drivers. Didn't obviously look too comfortable on that hard tyre. Now needs 8 points for 0.2, 17 for 0.6. So I'm looking at taking out Stroll this weekend. He's also struggled in Saudi Arabia, which is the track after Bahrain the last few years, so an obvious target for me to make way. Hulkenberg's threshold, even for a small price drop, is 12, so he's probably top of my shopping list along with the Canadian this weekend, just simply because there's next to no chance either of these drivers are going to get any form of price rise, I don't think, in Bahrain. Budget building for another week, or do we target premiums? I think simply because of the fact now we've got two drivers at $4.5 million, Doohan as well, he's dropped in price a bit more, and people have enough budget to go Piastri, McLaren, and Mercedes. I think for me, this is very much the approach I'm looking at this weekend, even for a -10. But again, it would mean moving out Haas for someone like Mercedes. I think that -10 immediately offsets that with the transfer. But I think you also want to still consider striking that nice balance between building budget and scoring points. I think having Mercedes in, even though their price ceiling or price jump increase is lower than, say, a Haas or a V-Carb, you've got A, the consistency and reliability of two drivers in that team, and B, you've also got a very low threshold for Mercedes, even if the point ceiling the price gain ceiling is a lot less than someone like Haas. So I think for me, I'll be looking at Mercedes this weekend, or looking at them this weekend, bringing them back into my team after 1 week off. Just quickly on driver of the day, Tsunoda banked that in Japan. I think that saved his bacon a little bit, and to be honest, probably got away with not getting that minus $0.6 million drop. I think at various times in practice, Tsunoda did look comfortable in that Red Bull, but I'm by no means jumping at him simply because of the fact I want to see more from him in that car. For a driver that scored P12 or finished P12 in a race, he was anonymous the entire time. I think we saw more on-track action from Lance Stroll in P20 than we did from the Japanese driver. I'm personally not so sure for me. A, Tsunoda is worth a shot just right now, and B, why driver of the day still exists in F1 Fantasy. We saw Antonelli get it last week in China for a relatively average drive, all things considered, and Tsunoda, I think, obviously had the fan favorite on home soil, but I'm not so sure that's going to necessarily be a dictating factor in tracks like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, even in Miami, for example. So just keep that in mind heading into this race weekend. On transfer targets and my kind of initial thoughts on these two guys, obviously talked about them very briefly. Hadjar's in relation to, I guess, his recent performances. That DNF, and the same for Jack, drops off from Australia. They're at 3-race rolling average. And look, on face value, some of these statistics don't exactly look that great. Negative 0.3 points per race, negative 1.0 positions gained, and not exactly a differential asset at 46% for Isaac Hadjar. But we've seen he is a driver that has been able to put it inside the top 10 in free practice, in qualifying, 11 points in the China sprint, 8 in Japan. I have every expectation he'll be able to get close to that figure. And again, because of the fact his threshold is not high, becomes for me the absolute number one target in that budget enabling category, ahead of Bortoletto, ahead of even maybe the Haas drivers. And I'm just really liking what I'm seeing from Isaac Hadjar. Really impressive to see that mental mindset bounce back from that formation lap era in Australia, and obviously contribute to Racing Bulls' resurgence in the midfield in the early goings of this season. On Jack Doohan, a driver I've not necessarily been all that impressed with F1-wise. There's a lot of speculation he won't have a seat in Miami, but that doesn't necessarily dissuade me from having him in my team for the next couple of weeks at the very least for that budget gain upside. Scores of 11 and 6. Again, like Hadjar, that DNF drops off his average, has had a few overtakes. Alpine's, there and thereabouts in the midfield, probably not the best start to the season they've had, but I think Doohan becomes a driver to me that, as long as he keeps it on track, and I think he'll absolutely want to try and do that, may well be an option just for the sake of his own career in Formula One. With every error, mistake, etc. he makes, the rumours swirl around him and Colapinto swapping seats in Miami. So yeah, sure, he had that issue in free practice in Japan where he obviously forgot to turn off the DRS. But for me personally, I do think Jack kind of fits the bill as an enabler that I could run for just a couple of weeks if I need to bring in someone or an asset like Mercedes in, say, Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. Now, speaking of that, this is kind of where my early team thoughts are for this race weekend. I've thought about, a couple of different directions I could go down in the desert. And personally, I think, again, I talked about this in my budget building video in my final thoughts last week, just with how the pricing model is structured in 2025. It's almost like some of our decisions are already made for us before we see free practice. And I think that's a good thing and a bad thing, but simply because of these price gain thresholds that we've seen in F1 Fantasy Tools budget building analysis, it just becomes almost too obvious for me for at least the next couple of weeks, and while we're building budget, to move towards those assets that are going to appreciate in value once again. I think budget building will become much less of a priority later down the line. And I talked about that again in my weekend notes in terms of when do we start targeting premiums and when do we start targeting or continuing to target budget building assets. I don't think there's an absolute correct time in mind for when that happens. I think there'll be weekends where we do focus more on budget building, in Japan, I think Bahrain perhaps continually. As soon as we get to the mid-season break, I can very much see the points focus becoming more of a priority for many of our teams. But right now, I still think having 3 to 4 B-tier assets in the drivers and the constructors that are likely to go up in value is going to set up our team nicely. I mean, at least you can see here, Oscar and McLaren, they're not going anywhere in my team. Oscar's one of the best value, most underappreciated fantasy, or not underappreciated, but undervalued fantasy assets. He should be at least 3 to 4 million higher. But notwithstanding that, I think McLaren and Oscar are not going anywhere. And I think Mercedes, you're starting to see people move towards 3 premium assets as opposed to 2 for, the first few races of the season, because they can afford it with, the likes of Hadjar, Bortoletto and Doohan on the menu now. But I do think there will probably be a juncture. We've got Limitless in Miami for a lot of teams. I think that's going to be when you see most teams flick the switch and have a slightly more prioritized approach to building a better points base over just purely budget, which is what we're seeing at the moment. So there are 4 drivers, kind of 3 to 4 assets at risk this weekend for me. Stroll, Hülkenberg, the obvious 2, and I've talked about them already, and Haas simply because of the fact they're occupying a constructor slot, which I could well bring or move out for someone like Mercedes. So why don't we bring my team up on screen here? I can show you kind of what my team is looking like for Bahrain. And for those of you on the deadline stream, one of my favorite deadline streams I've ever done in the lead up to Japan, we obviously talked about F1 Fantasy for those 2 hours, but we also talked about fast food, burgers, the weather. I'll never be a meteorologist. And I think it goes to show that the F1 Fantasy community's obviously so invested in this game, but it's great to see there's so much varied discussion in other things, even when the deadline is an hour and a half away. So anyway, back to my team. So I've obviously talked about Hülkenberg and Stroll. Now, I could run Haas for another weekend. I wouldn't be, against the idea of that. I think I've talked about how someone like Isaac Hadjar is a priority transfer for this week for his value and his likely increase in price in Bahrain. So I think necessarily bring him in here, and then that would leave 21.5. I'm 0.2 short for someone like George Russell. I absolutely love to get him in my team. But Kimi Antonelli is perfectly fine as well. To be honest, Kimi's driven really well through 3 races, going on to F1 Fantasy Tools statistics. He's outscored Russell in 2 out of the last 3 races. Obviously had the driver of the day in China, which probably helped to score a little bit, and then the fastest lap in Japan. So, maybe not a true reflection of Kimi Antonelli's fantasy production. I really love the consistency of George Russell. He's a great qualifier, as we know, but I think Kimi at his price, a very solid alternative. So, if I didn't want to take a hit, I could very much see myself going down this path. And that's why I kept Oscar, because even though it would mean 8 million on the side, it also meant I'd have to likely move out Lando Norris to go down a second premium asset in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia if I wanted that. Now, I think personally, if you have 3 free transfers this week, you're in a very good position. I was kind of backed into a corner to use my 3 last weekend, and I'm very okay with that. I'd happily take a -10. And one move I very much would consider taking a -10 for my team. You might have 3 transfers, so much less of a concern, is bringing in Mercedes. We're keeping Hadjar in this situation. And then the third driver slot would be Jack Doohan, most likely, again, for that points threshold. I mean, I'd probably prefer, if I could get to Fernando Alonso, I'd probably prefer him for his reliability, but the fact is he is a driver that is one of the lowest targets for me just because of his price, because of his points threshold for this week. He's had 2 DNFs this season so far. I think Fernando will be a great option once this rolling average comes back to a more normal kind of threshold for him to reach for a price rise. So for that reason, I think Jack, again, I've said, simply because he has to keep the car on the track to even just negate some of those rumors around him and Colapinto in Alpine. So I think for me, this could be one such option. Now, I haven't really thought too much about any other targets outside of constructors this week. Ferrari, for me, is still a no-go. I mean, what about Red Bull? And a couple of people have asked me about that. I'm not entirely against the idea of Red Bull, but again, it would need, for my team, you might have more budget to stretch to Jack Doohan instead of Gabriel Bortoleto. You'd need to get these 2 guys in here. I'm not so sure Red Bull's for me, again, because I'm liking what I'm seeing from Mercedes at a much cheaper price. Mercedes are outperforming Red Bull, even though I think Tsunoda's a much better alternative than Lawson in that second seat. But again, even on weekends where Mercedes aren't necessarily going to be on the podium, they're still outscoring Red Bull by a pretty decent amount of points most race weeks, or at least the last couple of race weeks. Enough to me to make the point that I'd probably just prefer to go for Mercedes for their price over a team like Red Bull. And I think Max, great history at Suzuka, but I'm not sure Red Bull is for me. So I think for me, this is probably my early team thoughts for this weekend. I'm not saying my decision will change between now and the deadline. This would again require a -10 for my team, but as I said, Mercedes will no doubt pay that -10 off over Haas. And obviously not going down the triple Haas route for more than a week also fills me with a little bit more confidence. So that's kind of where my head's at. As always, I'll be back with my final thoughts later in the week and hopefully a deadline stream in Bahrain, guys. But as I said, if you're new around here, you're enjoying this content, please do drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I'll leave it there for now. Have a great rest of your day and I will see you all very soon.